Welcome to Equity versus Equality in Public Libraries, a TLN member forum discussion. So for the purposes of our discussion, we want to develop an understanding of what is equity versus equality with some basic definitions. We had this event earlier with our membership and discussed those as groups, and we'll try to do our best to present that through the slides today. We want to learn how equity and equality differ from each other, and we want to discover how equity and equality fit into the context of the work that we do in libraries. So when we had our live session, we called it a brave space rather than a safe space because we were all actively sharing what this context means to us. So for any discussion around identities, I want to remind everyone that each of us brings the intersectionality of all the pieces of our identities to any conversation that we have. So this identity wheel here shows us many different pieces that make up each individual. A lot of our discussion today will focus around race or Black versus white or the context of those ideas within libraries. But any conversation that any of us has all of these different pieces of our identities wrapped into what we are bringing to our discussion. So our original event had a lot of planning and facilitation go into it. I'm Steve Bowers, the director of the Library Network. Jasmine Parker, who works at the Ferndale Area District Library, helped put together our entire presentation and help facilitate our discussions. Kristen Shelley from East Lansing Public Library, their director, also helped put together all of our event and materials, as well as Holly Teasdale from Lyon Township Public Library, a TLN member.
So if you're looking at this photo, you may be wondering, who are these people? And why were they arrested? Well, these 9 college students became known as the Tougaloo 9. They were college students at Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi. And in March 1961, they decided that they were going to stage a sit-in at the Jackson Public Library in Jackson, Mississippi, calling for the library to integrate. So the library was segregated. This was something that was very strategic and very well planned out, so much so that Medgar Evers, the late and great civil rights activist who was later assassinated for his role in the civil rights movement, trained them for the sit-in. He, at the time, was the president for the Jackson branch of the NAACP. And they wanted to really have all hands on deck with this. So the media was involved in terms of like Black newspapers and spreading the word that this was going to happen. Funny enough, the library director, the day of the sit-in, received word that they were planning to stage a sit-in, and she was actually preparing to involve law enforcement that once they came to just immediately arrest them, so there wasn't any type of big deal. There was no scene. Unfortunately, she was unaware that while she was making preparations for law enforcement to immediately remove them, they were already in the library and this was already unfolding. One of the students went up to a librarian and asked for a book that was not available at the Black library. And so that is how it ended up ensuing, or that is how it started off. And of course, they refused to leave and were arrested and charged with breach of peace. So they were released the next day. And from this, it is very successful because the NAACP is then able to launch a civil lawsuit against the Jackson Public Library, calling for the library to integrate in January of 1962. So almost, but not completely, a year after they staged the sit-in, you have a civil action lawsuit that is being launched against the library. And by June of 1962, in a U.S. District Court, Judge William Harold Cox decides that the Jackson Public Library must integrate. So this is huge. This is huge. We're going to hear the year 1962 a lot throughout this presentation. It is obviously within the 20th century, but 1962 is a very big transitional year within American libraries. The Tougaloo Nine and what they were able to achieve really serves as a domino effect to try and come against the systemic racism and the discrimination that Black people were experiencing within the public libraries during this time. So a huge thank you to the Tougaloo Nine. And if you didn't know them, now you do. Okay, so importance of equity versus equality in public libraries. So we're going to start off with some public library history. And this is important because we got to know where we've come from, where we are, so we know where we're going. So one of the earlier libraries comes about in the 18th century. And of course, that is the Library Company of Philadelphia. And it's founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731. In the 19th century, we have the Library Company of Colored People, or for colored people, and this is co-founded by Robert Purvis in 1833. And so it's worth mentioning because when we think about segregated libraries, it could be tempting to say, oh, this was just a problem in the Deep South. This was a Southern issue. And that, unfortunately, is just not the truth. This was a Northern issue. This was an American issue. This was not just a Southern issue. And so within a period that is known, according to research, as self-actualization from 1828, for about almost 100 years, you have 50 African-American library and literary societies that are popping up all throughout the nation because libraries were segregated. What's so interesting about that to me is the fact that Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, is not on the books. It's not adopted into law until 1898, yet and still 1828, and definitely the Library Company of Colored People in 1833 is proof that separated but equal is already happening before America officially adopts this into legislation. So it's almost as though Plessy versus Ferguson is something that becomes a way to co-sign what is already happening. So that's very important to note. It should also be noted that ALA comes around in the 19th century. They are founded in 1876, and we'll touch more on ALA later in the presentation, but that is definitely something that is worth noting. The 20th century is one of the most transitional periods of history in public libraries within America because you're starting to see things like the Tougaloo Nine. And so that's obviously exciting because you're starting to see efforts being taken to desegregate libraries, public libraries. We'll get into the 21st century, but for now, we're going to stay in the 20th century at least by discussing the Alexandria Library sit-in that happened in 1939. And this happened in Alexandria, Virginia. There was an up-and-coming African-American attorney. His name is Samuel Wilbert Tucker, and he was a recent graduate from Howard University. He was very infuriated over the fact that there were segregated libraries, that Alexandria, was a segregated library. And so he decided that he was going to do something about it. He went out, he recruited 5 willing young men who decided that they were willing to stage a sit-in. And so in August of 1939, that is exactly what they did. So this is very well planned out. He received word when the men entered the library, and he also received word when they were leaving the library, so much so that he had a photographer there to capture the men being arrested and taken from the library, because when they refused to leave, they were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. Similarly to what happens with the Tougaloo Nine, word gets out. He wanted the photo to be taken so that it could circulate within Black newspaper to, have this rally cry against the racism and the discrimination that they were receiving in Alexandria and the library. It works. And by 1940, they decided that they're going to come together as a community to see the next steps to take about, the sit-in. Well, unfortunately, Tucker falls very ill. he becomes very ill to the point where he can't pursue something that kind of becomes his life mission. And unfortunately, they reach a compromise in this meeting in 1940 without him to settle for a Black library. So the sad thing about this is that it would not be until 1959 that African-American adults, and I preference adults like that for a reason, because it would not be until 1962 that Black children would then be allowed to utilize the Alexandria Public Library. So we're talking about 22 years that it takes to desegregate the Alexandria Public Library in Alexandria, Virginia, which is very disheartening. 1962, we're hearing that year again. We've got the Tougaloo Nine successfully desegregating the Jackson Public Library, and now we have the Alexandria Public Library successfully being desegregated as well. So what I am about to share with you is something that I came across during my research, and it really stood out to me. What you're looking at the descendants of one of the protesters from August in 1939 who was involved in the Alexandria Library sit-in. This is during the 80th anniversary to commemorate what their ancestor did. And I just thought that this was such a moving and powerful way to pay a testament to what, you know, bravery and courage looks like. And, you know, there you have it. What a legacy his family has to cherish behind what he did. So the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of times before this research, I associated the Civil Rights Movement with seeing diners and people protesting at diners, or, you know, trying to march and get, you know, voting rights and things of that nature, equal rights in that sense. I didn't associate it so much with libraries. And I hope after this presentation today, you will remember that libraries played a huge part as being places for gathering, for protests and fighting against injustice as people were working to try to get library cards, Black people working to get library cards and having access to library materials. So this is not something to underlook or to forget about. And that's not something that is readily accessible within history, but it should be. Just as African Americans were harassed and beaten and lost their jobs for trying to vote, the same tactics were being used for those who were trying to secure access for a library card. And that is something that, while is disturbing, it's worth knowing. We have the Civil Rights Movement. We have all of these things that are happening in 1962. And it's important to note that this is post Brown versus Board of Education, which becomes adopted into law in 1954 and overrules, you know, Plessy versus Ferguson, and saying separate is not equal. And yet, and still, we're still seeing Black people being discriminated against in the public libraries, because although you have legislation, there isn't people who are working to enforce that it is being taken into consideration and that people are following the law. So that is why we commend people like the Tougaloo Nine and the efforts that people within the Civil Rights Movement were making to try and secure people to having the right to vote. Something else that should definitely be noted are the Faith Cabin Libraries. So the Faith Cabin Libraries, they were mainly in South Carolina and Georgia. And these libraries were similar to the Carnegie libraries that were being erected all throughout the country. Carnegie libraries I believe they come into the scene in the 20th century. And they were donated funds that then allowed for libraries to be able to be built. So that's a great thing, but these were segregated libraries because many of them were for Black people. They were for, you know, Black libraries. So Faith Cabins is similar to that, but again, it is something that is being given to people of color in rural areas who were not being accepted or being given the same access that they deserved. And the Freedom Libraries is another form of libraries that were developed and kind of managed by volunteers within the Deep South, particularly in Mississippi. The summer of 1964 is known as Freedom Summer. And you had over 1,000 white Northerners who go down to Mississippi to volunteer their time to work in spaces to create school libraries, to create library access and voter registration for Black and Brown people. So this is huge. And this came at a cost. This came at a huge cost. There were bombings, there was terror, there were intimidation tactics, there was murder. 3 civil rights activists who were involved with the Freedom Libraries and Freedom Summer lost their lives. Those men being James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. And I want to share something that was definitely moving to me during my research. So what you're looking at is a picture of Rita Schwerner. She is the widow of Michael Schwerner. And I just thought that that was so deeply touching that she decided to carry that torch on in the absence and the loss of her husband. Despite him being murdered for trying to help people, she didn't allow that to scare her to not doing the work. She continued the work. And I just think, you know, again, it's so moving. And we need to remember that as well, that in the midst of the atrocities that people of color were facing, trying to have access to libraries, that there were allies, there were white people, there were people who were not Black, who were trying to help African-American people have the rights that they so deserved. And that should be acknowledged and celebrated as well. Also, even after post Brown, something that was being done in libraries is that they were taking furniture out. They were taking furniture out so that people wouldn't sit, so that they could get their stuff and go. So grab and go was not just something that started in 2020 with the pandemic. Grab and go was something that they were doing a long time ago as a form of injustice. So it's so important to remember that history. Now we're going to go to ALA. So again, this, you know, ALA comes into existence in the 19th century. And for 142 years, ALA remains quiet about what is happening. So it is seeing the atrocities, it is seeing the segregation, and it is not saying anything. Well, in the summer of 2018, this changes at the annual conference in Louisiana. They decide to adopt a resolution at 6 points that basically says this happened. You know, there were segregated libraries. This was wrong. This was not okay, that we didn't do anything about it at the time. They apologize to African Americans. They commend African Americans who fought against this form of injustice. They welcome African Americans and people of color to utilizing libraries. And something that definitely stands out to me is that they are taking into consideration how they can go about in the future preventing this from happening by having diversity, equity, and inclusion be a part of the practices that they are continuously trying to do to ensure that this isn't something that's reoccurring. Some people may say that this is a little too late, it's not enough, but it is a start. And I think that it should definitely be noted that they did at least acknowledge it as opposed to treating it like it didn't exist. And I think with their election of the first Chinese American president and Patty Wong, that they are truly trying to make a difference, even if it is coming slowly. Moving along to picture equity versus equality. So there's no way that you can picture equity versus equality without picture books. Come on. So here we are in the 21st century, and where are we? We're in a space where we're dealing with the First Amendment audits. We're dealing with conservative groups or just parents banding together to say this book shouldn't belong in the library. This is not fit for my child's reading and all of these things. Not to mention those of us who are people of color working in the profession, or people who belong to marginalized communities and experiencing microaggressions from our colleagues, people within the profession, or patrons, all of these things. But still, when we realize the history of public libraries in America, we can see that there has been some change, and at least acknowledging, problems and trying to be more open to inclusivity, diversity, and equity. And I will say, as an African-American woman working in this profession, that it has been hard. It has been extremely hard and sometimes discouraging. But one of the things that I try to remind myself is that to whom much is given, much is required. And also just having an understanding that I choose to be the one to help the many. And this is supported from my own personal philosophy by a woman by the name of Eliza Davis. She was of Jewish and British descent. And she was a fan of Charles Dickens. However, she did not like the way that Dickens went about portraying Jewish people. He and Oliver Twist wrote about Fagin, who is a character in the book, in a negative light because he's also Jewish. And she didn't like it, so she wrote to him. She figured, what do I have to lose? She wrote to Charles Dickens, and he wrote back, and he blows her off. He's like, whatever, lady, more or less. And she's like, I don't think so. I'm not settling for this. So she takes the time and she decides that she's going to use his own story to pull him in, to grab his attention. She takes, of course, A Christmas Story, and she utilizes the three ghosts of Christmas past, or the ghosts who visit Scrooge the night before Christmas, to convey her point on why he was capturing Jewish people in an inappropriate way. It works. She gets his attention. And not only does she get his attention, he decides that he is going to change the tone in which he is depicting Jewish people. My mind was blown when I read that, because this is Charles Dickens. This is the Charles Dickens. And then you have the Eliza Davis say, no, you're not going to disrespect my people. You're not going to group us all together and disrespect us in this way. She becomes the one to help the many. She uses her position, her platform, her pen, her courage to speak up, and affects change in such a monumental way. And that inspires me. And I believe that it can inspire us in our various places and our various seats at the table, as we factor in how we can become the one to help the many. So moving into picture books, we have The Snowy Day. The Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Heath. So this is published in 1962. And it becomes, according to the Horn Book, the first full picture book to show an African-American boy as a hero. That's huge. 1962. That year may sound familiar to you because the Tougaloo Nine helps to desegregate the Jackson Public Library. Alexandria Public Library is finally desegregated as well. And now we have the Snowy Day. There's the recap. 1962 is a transitional year for people of color and for American libraries. So Keats is the descendant. His parents were Polish immigrants, and he was raised in New York. So he's around all this culture, all this diversity. And the only thing that he sees in picture books are people who look like him. He just sees white children. He doesn't see children of color. They're absent from the picture books during that time of his childhood. So one day he's looking through this magazine and he comes across a photo series of a Black child. And he does not know why he's drawn to this Black child, but he is. So he decides that he's going to cut the pictures out and store them in safekeeping so that he can go and look at the pictures from time to time. So some years pass and he comes across the pictures and he thinks to himself, why did I keep these pictures? why do I still have these? And it was a light bulb moment for him, because he realizes that he kept the pictures because he had never seen photos of a Black child. And so he is so moved by that he decides to become the one to influence the many. And the pictures that you are seeing represent the Black child, who then becomes the inspiration behind the Black boy featured in The Snowy Day. Doesn't stop there. He's getting people writing into him, and a teacher writes into him and she says, I just finished reading The Snowy Day with my students, and they grabbed a brown crayon and they drew a picture of themselves. And she says, no, you don't understand. Normally when we finish reading books, they grab a pink crayon to draw themselves, but they can finally see themselves. That's like hashtag ugly crying moment, right? Because representation is huge. Being able to see yourself represented is huge. And that should definitely not be taken lightly. And now, of course, we have books like Change Sings by Amanda Gorman, who also happens to be the youngest inaugural poet, and Lauren Long. And this book is so touching and so wonderful because you're seeing children of all different races and ethnicities and capabilities working together to get the job done. I don't think without The Snowy Day, we would have Change Things. And there are so many more books that we can throw into this, right? But the fact of the matter is that equity versus equality is starting to become more present within our picture books. The question that we should be asking ourselves as library professionals and library workers is this becoming a part of the work that we're doing, not just in the form of policy, but taking actionable steps to ensure that we are trying to become the one to help the many, to influence the many, taking a look at our library collection to know what's there, because the picture books are showing us that they're having these themes within them. And so it's up to us to know what we have in our library collection and to build it accordingly. This is a quote by Amanda Gorman. And I think that it speaks so perfectly towards this work of equity versus equality, because it isn't easy work. It's hard work that could get us into some good trouble, but it's necessary all the same. For there is always light if we're only brave enough to see it, if we're only brave enough to be it. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Steve Bowers.
All right. So in our live session, we had breakout groups to discuss what is equity versus equality. I think a lot of us have an idea of what equality is. It's a lot of the public discourse in the United States around having everything equal for all citizens. Even though we know a lot of the original laws that called for equality, we're talking about white men in particular. Women and people of color were often left out of that. But since we are doing a recording for today, we're going to move forward with this video that Jasmine has selected that really helps us define together what is equity versus equality.
Before we can talk about equity versus equality, I want to first define diversity. At Inclusive Communities, we like to say diversity in its simplest definition means differences. We all have differences, from our glasses to our weight to how much money we have. That is diversity, and no matter how much people say it's hard to find diversity, that's not true. Diversity exists. It's about taking the time to acknowledge its existence and work to ensure action is taken to embrace these differences, not alienate them. Equality is often equated to fairness and sameness, and is based in the misconception that we all have the same needs and the same solution will work for everyone. Equity is based in access and opportunity, with the understanding that we each start with different advantages and disadvantages, and thus have different needs to attain access and opportunity. To understand equity, we have to compare it to equality. Now, I love this equity versus equality graphic, as it's the best explanation of the difference between the two. On the equality side, you see that we've got three individuals, our tall guy, our short girl, and our friend in the wheelchair. And you see that they're all trying to watch this baseball game, but there's this fence. With equality, they've each been given a box to use to be able to see the game. But obviously that's not working, because our tall friend is now super tall and sees very clearly over the fence, while our short girl can just barely see, and she's still kind of on her tiptoes and struggling to see the game, while the person in the wheelchair can't see it all and they can't even get on the box. On the equity side of this picture, you can see that now we've given each individual exactly what they need to be able to see the game. The person in the wheelchair has a ramp, so they can clearly get to the top and see the full game. The shorter girl has two boxes, which is what she needed to comfortably be able to see, and the tall person has no boxes at all because they didn't need the extra assistance in the first place. Equity is a process, which means it is continuous. We can't gain equity by changing just one thing. For example, the equity side of this photo shows our friend in the wheelchair has gained equity at this fence, but the work is not done. True progressive equity is about how can we ensure that he has equitable opportunities at all of the hypothetical and real fences in his life. Equity requires power, resources, and social responsibility to work hand in hand to change the structures and provide opportunities to those who were institutionally left out, marginalized, or oppressed. Equity is hard, but it's essential for us to make change in the lives of those who have been historically depicted as less than. From individuals with disabilities like physical, developmental, and mental, to people living in poverty without access to food or education or healthcare. It's important for us to understand that there is a long history of discrimination, which has created the present day inequities which don't allow these individuals the same access to opportunity than those who don't have those differences. One of the greatest gifts that we give to students that we work with is the opportunity to share their story and to find value in their voice. And this increases awareness and a sense of empowerment. Everyone has their own stuff. Everyone is going through something that challenges their emotional and physical capacity to be great, but there is power in connection. So now here's your challenge. Be brave and seek out those opportunities to have authentic conversations with those that are different than you. Find out what makes them unique and what brings them joy. Then you do the same. Share your story because you have value as well. Now you've built community. And with community, we have power. We is always stronger than me.
It seems as though the video wanted to make a comeback. There you go. Well, the takeaways, what are the takeaways? Equity is a process, which means it is continuous. We can't gain equity by changing just one thing. Equity requires power, resources, social responsibility to work hand in hand to change the structures and provide opportunity to those who are institutionally left out, marginalized, or oppressed. It is impossible to have equality without equity. There is a role for libraries to play in working on equity in their communities as inaction sustains inequities. What is your personal takeaway from today's discussion?
Thanks, Jasmine, for giving us our whole session today and putting it all together and wrapping up equity versus equality for us. We have also put together a resource list here if you want to do some more follow-up on diversity, equity, and inclusion, including links to the video you saw today and some other videos that we thought were useful and then some of the national literature from the ALA Code of Ethics website and the Library Bill of Rights website. We're also starting a DEI toolkit for TLN members and anyone else that wants to access that. To get you started though, here's a couple more books that you may be interested in reading on, and some free online training courses and some programs that are free to take online. And beginning in January of 2022, next year, just in a couple of weeks here, we'll start an EDI series of webinars for TLN members that you can all follow up with if you're interested in learning more. So we have a lot of questions that may have come out of today's discussion that we'll move forward and continue to work and ask. But how do we work to make people feel that they belong in our libraries? So that sense of belonging is a sense of inclusion as we're working to reach all of the different people in our communities. We can ask ourselves, how can we promote learning people's stories? So a lot of the stories that Jasmine shared with us today, a lot of the history, we may not have known about libraries and how we have been part of the systems and processes that have promoted inequity in the history of the United States. So how do we share these stories amongst ourselves? How do we do this with our staff? And how do we do it with the public that we serve? And how do we make this work relevant to everyone in our community? So we started out our presentation looking at the slide of all the intersections of our identities. And even though we may think that we're serving a community that looks like us or everyone's the same, we are all bringing, you saw all those different parts of each of our identities, and all of those parts need to be represented and assumed are part of our community, and we need to have them be part of our collections, part of our policies, and part of the access that we provide. How can we get people to support the idea that should be applied to everyone in our libraries? So just because we know there was segregation in the 1960s doesn't mean that those problems ended in the 1960s. You know, we are still working on equity to bring people up to an equal starting point so that we can all partake in what the library has to offer. And then finally, how can we work to implement equity in public libraries? This is where we work, this is who we are, and how can we take that call to action from the American Library Association Code of Ethics that says, you know, really, we've always been a part of the problem. We weren't really neutral spaces in the past. We need to continue to work on equity in the future. So how do public libraries do that? So we don't have all the answers to all of these either. That's why the work is ongoing and we'll move forward with it. So we want to close today with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education." So to think critically is to do self-examination and to really look at how things have always been and figure out how we can take them to a new equitable place in the future. So finally, we have our reference list here since we're librarians. If you want to follow up with any of the information in today's presentation. And again, we're building a new repository that will be accessible on the TLN website. And we'll ask all of you to contribute to that repository in the future as we build an information resource that can assist all of us on doing equity work for justice in public libraries. Thank you again, Jasmine, for all your work today. And thanks for everybody for watching our presentation.
Thank you, Steve.